to welcome our guests today, as well as all our workforce, be it staff members, consultants, service contract holders, volunteers, and interns. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm delighted that this is happening today. Finally, we want to make inclusion happen in UNDP and to make UNDP accessible for all. So the purpose of this session is mainly to have a brainstorming session on how we can advance the inclusion of people with disabilities in UNDP. The format that we are going to be using is there will be a few words of introduction by two of our senior leaders, and then we will have a panel presentation of a number of distinguished guest speakers. So in order to start, and I will explain after what we will do after the panelists speak, I will hand over first to Jens Wendel. Jens is the ASG and Director for the Bureau of Management Services. So Jens, over to you.
Thank you very much. For me also, good morning and good afternoon. My role in UNDP as part of being part of senior management is to take care of the back office side, everything that is boring, the budget, the HR, the security, but also the premises, etc., etc., etc. This matter of having an inclusive managerial posture, this idea that not only do we do what we ought to do on the program side, but we also do it on the management side. We also purchase for more than $2 billion a year, and we're interested maybe to learn how we can also raise expectations to our suppliers and make sure that they also behave in line with the way we think this ought to be done. Overall, the United Nations purchase for more than $15 billion a year, and I also sit, and UNDP sits in, and can influence the behavior of the entire system. And I think for us, we need to sit down and learn more how we can do this in practical terms. And therefore, I, for one, look much forward to listen to the presentation and kind of come away from here with both things that can influence our strategic thinking, but also things that may lead to action very quickly. And then also, we understand, like in so many other areas, the area of moving inclusiveness forward requires partnerships. So therefore, it's also important that we emphasize that side, and maybe we can learn something of being, for lack of better word, maybe a better partner, and have more capacity to partner in this area. Before I close for my remarks, I just want to acknowledge that in the room, we also have Helen Clarks, the chef de cabinet, which is the administrator of UNDP. And then also we have the deputy director of the Africa Bureau, which is the largest bureau in UNDP. And therefore, we are genuinely trying to, I think if I speak on behalf of you, to listen and learn, and then find a way for us so we can be more relevant in this space. So with those few remarks, thank you very much. And thank you to our panelists for taking time to be with us.
Thank you, Jens. And now I would like Sarah Wu to give us some welcoming words. Sarah is the Deputy Director for our Bureau Program and Policy Support. And here, the important thing is that we are joining together the fact of the operation service plus the programmatic and policy agenda on the ground. So we are working jointly together. So Sarah, over to you.
Martelena, thank you so much. Thank you also to you and to Jens and our colleagues for organizing this today. Also our colleagues on the innovation facility, because I think part of a lot of what we'll be discussing today is how can we do development differently? How can we do it better? And I think the issues around the inclusion, disabilities, making UNDP a more inclusive and accessible place to work, also bringing this issue to the centrality of the work that we're doing through our regional bureaus with our country offices at the country level is so critical. So thank you again for organizing this, also to the panelists and really to all the participants. The timing of this could not be better. I think we can recognize we're celebrating collectively, it's a world, the decade, the 10-year anniversary of the convention. We're also at the point now where we're at the end of the first year of the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals and really the agenda and the aspirations and the ambitions that sets out in terms of the future that we want, and also very much leaving no one behind. And I think as we look at the totality of the convention and the work on the SDGs, as we call them, we really see where the opportunities are, but we also see where the challenges are and how we can work around this. We know that tomorrow is the International Day on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that the theme is really focusing on how we can achieve the 17 goals for the future that we want. And I think this session today really reminds us about Goal 17, which is very much, as Jan said, on the issue of partnerships. We know that with the ambition and the scope of what the SDGs represent for us, no member state, no NGO, no UN entity, no private sector company, no one can do this on their own. It's really about how do we engage in partnerships in a way that's better, that we can do business differently. It's also very much about leaving no one behind, and what we've seen as UNDP working with the other UN agencies, but also very much for the member states and the civil society and the other actors that we work with at the country level. Leaving no one behind is working in partnership with populations that sometimes can be disadvantaged, are disadvantaged, but not just as beneficiaries of programming or policies, but really very much as active agents of change. And I think for us, this is a critical lesson that we're seeing throughout the work, and that we really, through these kinds of discussions, that we understand better as UNDP, as a partner, how we can and should be doing this in a way that really creates change and that really leads us to the aspirations of the SDGs. So I think these kind of dialogues today and going forward is critical. I would also like to contextualize in the broader framework of innovation, and we have some colleagues today from our innovation team. And we have an innovation facility that challenges us, but really helps us to think about how we can do development differently. And I think what we've seen over the past decade or the past decades is business as usual doesn't work anymore. But we're really setting out to achieve what we want and are committed to achieve. And that we need to think about doing business, if I can call it, differently and better. And so the conversations that we're having through that innovation dialogue really sets out some good examples, also some good lessons learning, some reflection, and also some challenges back to us where we need to do better. And I'm delighted that today we have a colleague who's been working in Georgia actually on the issue of innovation, bringing that together with the disabilities agenda, looking at how through innovation we can actually strengthen public services. So I think there's a lot of different elements to this discussion. I think what comes out at the end for us is that this is extremely important, it's extremely timely, but I think through this collective discussion and what we'll be hearing today, it really points to the fact that we can't just, that we need to walk the talk. I think that's the correct metaphor, and that we really need to take this agenda forward collectively and with the feedback that we'll be hearing from you today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. So now we are going to start with the presentations of a panel of 5 panelists. And we have Georgia Dominique from the International Disability Alliance. We have Elaine Katz from the Kessler Foundation. And we have a surprise guest remotely from the Kessler Foundation that I'll give to you in a minute, the details. We also have Dr. Rashid from Gallaudet University. We have Katuna Sandrosh from our Georgia country office joining us remotely. And finally, we have Sue Myers from the National Organization on Disability. So I do want to welcome the panelists as well as all the other guests that have joined us during this meeting. Each of the panelists will have 5 to 6 minutes to make a presentation and introduce some of their ideas and insights that would help UNDP move the agenda forward. After the presentations, we will open it to questions, concerns, and answers. That will take around 30 to 40 minutes. Unfortunately, the country officers will not be able to pose the questions verbally, but we will handle the situation of what are the questions coming forward remotely. So let me start with the first panelist. That is Georgia Dominique. And Georgia comes from the International Disability Alliance. The Alliance is a network of 15 global and regional organizations of persons with disabilities and their families, bringing together over 1,000 organizations. So I'm sure we can have some beautiful insights over 5 to 6 minutes, maybe too brief, but I'm sure you will give us the gist of it. Thank you. Georgia, over to you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I'm Georgia. I'm with the International Disability Alliance Secretariat here in New York. I am here today on behalf of Vladimir Chuk, our Executive Director, who sends his apologies for not being able to come. He's a very charismatic speaker, so I hope you get to hear from him in the future. Thank you very much, UNDP, for this really excellent opportunity to share some of our experiences and best practices. We are really keen to work with you, all of our members, to achieving inclusive UNDP. Just to give you a very short introduction to IDA, we are called the International Disability Alliance. We have a number of global and regional organizations who are networks in themselves. We are classified as organizations of persons with disabilities because in order to be members of IDA, you must be majority led by persons with disabilities themselves. So this really reflects the disability motto of nothing about us without us, and especially the CRPD Article 4.3, which states that in the development of legislation, policies, and programs, states parties must closely consult and actively involve persons with disabilities in their conversations and consultations. To say a little bit more about the Alliance before I share some lessons that we've learned. We represent all constituencies of persons with disabilities, and we are in more than 180 countries, I believe, around the world. So we come with a very broad perspective, and we were very much a part of the drafting of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and our members have a lot of very practical experience. So we are always willing to work with everybody to make sure that our experience comes to the table. In terms of perhaps some ways in which we can think of how to make UNDP more inclusive, we can look at from two perspectives. The first would be how to mainstream disability within UNDP. What we really believe is that disability needs to be seen as a cross-cutting issue similar to gender. It can't be considered as an issue on its own. And with that in mind, it needs to be mainstreamed across the work of the entire agency. And that comes from both at the international level and here the work that you do in all of the various areas, but also in your country teams as well, and not just siloed as a disability project, but really crossing through everything. We also know that actively engaging in cross-agency initiatives is a great way to share best practices, to know what's going on. And Sarah, you're nodding here, I know you know. IDA is a member of the UN Partnership to Promote the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We're a member of the Interagency Support Group to the CRPD as well. These are really great opportunities to share experiences and knowledge, not just with UN agencies, but also with civil society. We would also very strongly recommend focal points on disability to really bring the work together, because often, and we see this very much in our own work at the international level, that we have commitments in the SDGs, we have commitments on the humanitarian side, we have commitments through CRPD, and somebody needs to be monitoring all of these. So having somebody that you can connect with is always a great way to work, and it also supports DPOs to know who we can go to coordinate with our work. At a country level, we would very strongly recommend that you consider the Washington Group short set of questions on disability for data collection. This will be really important in the coming years when data is, as data is collected more and more. Finally, just to say a couple of words on the participation of persons with disabilities, both within your offices and also working with DPOs. As I mentioned, the Alliance, we are national, we're at the local level, national level, regional level, and international level, and we are here to connect with you at any of those stages. The IDA Secretariat has contacts for everyone, so if in your UN country teams you're undertaking a program on persons with disabilities, we're more than happy to connect you. And UNPRPD might also be an interesting way to have a look at some of the programs or projects that have been run through there as well, to see how these partnerships have been working. Leading to action very quickly, something that you mentioned earlier. I think that one of the very first and the easiest steps that we can do is to ensure reasonable accommodation at every meeting on persons with disabilities. This is not just access to a room, but it's also sign language interpretation and closed captioning. These are things that we find still we have to fight for. And it's really a shame. When we come to conversations on persons with disabilities, 100% it should be a given that these services will be offered, and they should be factored into the budget from the very beginning. It shouldn't be something that we have to request. Of course, we hope that we will reach a point in the future when every meeting is accessible for every person, but we can take baby steps. Finally, there is a UN Accessibility Working Group that exists within the UN here in New York, and there's also one in Geneva. And we really recommend, if you're not already engaged, please be in touch with them. You can contact them through UNDP. It is a great group of very knowledgeable people who are able to provide very practical proposals for a way forward. So I think I'll leave it there. I hope that's been useful, and please feel free to use IDA if you need anything in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgia, and I'm sure we will definitely take your offer, not only from New York, but from every part of the world. So I hope they don't bombard you. So now I have the privilege of going to Kessler Foundation. Kessler is a public charity organization dedicated to improving the quality of life for individuals with disabilities. I have here two guest speakers, but the first one is very special. And it's very special because he is the son of the founder of the Kessler Foundation. He is a man who is determined and has been determined for decades to improve the agenda of people with disabilities. He's a physician, and in his research, he has been consistently developing work for artificial limbs and remains an expert in anything related to accommodating people with disabilities. The reason why he's very special today is because at 94 years, he still wanted to support us and be present with us, showing his determination and courage to support us and move the agenda forward. And there's something special also regarding him that I will let you know after the video. So we are going to project a very 1-minute video on Dr. Jerry Kessler from the Kessler Foundation.
As we prepare to celebrate the anniversary of UNCRPD, I want to take this opportunity to reflect on the past and envision the promise of the future. While this most milestone treaty celebrates a decade, the history of the United Nations and its stable community start at the San Francisco Conference in 1945. My father, Dr. Henry Kessler, had the honor of participating at this historic event. The past 70 years, the United Nations responded by providing medical institutions the new technique and equipment, and once again provided most important human quality, dignity. Our new challenge is to incorporate, integrate, empower, and appreciate the disabled community. While I have had joyous days of providing my patients the opportunity to walk, drive, and work, my quest is the first step in unleashing the dynamic power of the disabled. As a United Nations staff professional, you certainly are at the forefront of delivering on this next chapter. I applaud you. Together, we are now have the opportunity to clarify of our new challenge, and I am positive that with appropriate resources, the United Nations will once again provide an illuminating path filled with hope, dignity, and confidence.
So you can see from his voice that he's still powerful and strong and wanting to move the agenda forward. So on that note, I'm going to hand it over to Aileen. Aileen is the Senior Vice President for Grants and Communications in the Kessler Foundation. So I do want to welcome her and hand over to her. And I'm sure she will give us other general and more specific recommendations for UNDP. So over to you, Aileen.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here this morning. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is talk a little bit about Kessler Foundation, give some examples of the work we do, and then provide a few recommendations. The Kessler Foundation, as you heard a little bit, is a global leader in rehabilitation research, and we seek to improve cognition, mobility, and long-term outcomes for people with disabilities. We conduct research in areas such as spinal cord, traumatic brain injury, multiple sclerosis, and stroke. We're also testing right now 3 different types of robots that can help with movement. And we also have one of the only MRI centers in the United States that's dedicated only to research. I lead our program center, and what we do is fund innovative programs both in New Jersey, where we're based, and nationally, to increase the persistent unemployment of people with disabilities. Over the past 9 years, we've devoted about $33 million to this effort. We target all kinds of ventures, new businesses, job training, job development. We've partnered with corporations such as Lowe's, OfficeMax, Pepsi, all to increase the initiatives of people with disabilities. Our largest grants are our signature grants, and they're all collaborative. We've worked with the private sector as well as governments. And truly what we're trying to do is provide some seed funding so that organizations can try some things that have never been done before. It's really an honor to speak here today. You saw from Dr. Jerry Kessler, who's the son of Dr. Henry H. Kessler. And what you may not know is that he was a leading orthopedic surgeon and rehabilitation pioneer who founded Kessler Institute in 1948, following his extensive rehab experience during World War II. But in 1915, he was asked by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration to implement its worldwide efforts and offer technical advice and assistance to member nations to assist in rehabilitation services after aftermath of World War II. So he worked globally. He worked in India, he worked in Greece, and he really saw that victory over disability was a way to foster international collaboration, human resources, human development, and world peace. So it really is an honor to be here to talk about that. Enough about our background. We'll get to the meat of this stuff. So I just want to share with you a little bit about our national survey on employment that we did in 2015. It was conducted by the University of New Hampshire. We looked at 3,000 households in the U.S. in all 50 states that had at least one person with a disability between ages 18 and 64. We learned some very important things. It was one of the first surveys that looked at what people do to overcome disabilities, not just identify problems. So we saw that more than 68 people with disabilities were striving to work. By that, we meant that they're either working, actively preparing for work, searching for work, overcoming barriers, or seeking additional hours. In addition, we saw that people with disabilities were employed more than 35 hours a week, with more than 61% of those working over 40 hours a week. We also learned, as you mentioned earlier, that workplace accommodations and accommodation in general are very important. But there's really three kinds that we don't often talk about. So of the survey participants, almost 29% looked at flexible start and stop schedules, working from home, taking more breaks during the day. About 14% wanted modified job duties, which could mean reduced hours, light duty, less demanding tasks. And 13.6% talked about what you mentioned before, was building accessibility was extremely important. But lastly, and what may be critical for your work here, is that through the survey, we saw most people found jobs through either online resources or informally through family and friends, which has a lot of implications when you're looking to do recruitment. So what does this also mean for the UNDP? The bottom line is, at least in the US, most Americans with disabilities are looking for work. And if we extrapolate that, I'm sure that's worldwide also. And we're seeing here that because of the legislation over the past few years, more American companies are open to hire people with disabilities. And again, more people are likely to find jobs through family and friends. And if you think about how people in general look for jobs, it's usually through family and friends, giving them the lead. I just want to share with you, in the limited time we have, one example of a model that's worked in the US and that could be extrapolated and worked in other situations. So in 2015, we began funding a project called 21 Enable in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And it was an initiative of the United Way there, a nonprofit on-the-ground agency. And it works to build the capacity of corporations hiring people with disabilities by focusing on youth who are leaving high school, moving into college settings. And it was done with a large private supermarket chain there called Giant Eagle Supermarkets. And the important piece of this is that it used a career transition liaison, an individual who came from the community, who had expertise in disability employment that was actually embedded in a company. And what that person did was help the company train the employees on disability awareness, work with recruitment, work with troubleshooting, observing job skills, helping train with job skills. And through our funding, this was now has expanded to the University of Pittsburgh, the city of Pittsburgh. But the reason we're interested in this is that we saw this as an innovative public-private model of something that can be done to increase a company's willingness to hire people with disabilities, because oftentimes today there's a lot of reasons why they don't get involved, but this provides them a resource from the community to help them get involved. The last piece I just wanted to share with you, and Shelley London is here from the Poses Family Foundation, is one of the new projects that both of our foundations are involved with is taking a leader in the disability world, and this is Randy Lewis from Walgreens, who's formerly the executive of Walgreens, who really was an innovator in hiring people with disabilities in the corporate market space for distribution centers, and putting him on a board. And because he is very dynamic speaker and magnetic personality, putting him in a room with other business executives, it's that peer-to-peer idea of sharing. This is what I did. This is how you can benefit your business and return on investment. So I think the point here is it's very important to have whoever your leaders are in the different communities, whether it's in the business community or nonprofit community, oftentimes share their positive experiences with their colleagues. Because again, that's the way, one person hires somebody with a disability, they know they're successful, they know what they can do, they can go within the community. Again, it's that networking in a different way to really extend that process. So again, what you can look at is public-private partnerships, internal champions, whether that's within UNDP or your local communities. Have timetables, targeted outcomes. I think you need to make sure you're on have a time frame to do it. Your flexibility in your job tasks. You have friendly recruitment systems. I saw from some of your literature, your access is good, but maybe in the US that is, maybe not necessarily in other countries. And make sure those in leadership positions, whether it's top down, bottom up, all have the buy-in, which you mentioned again, for disability employment. So I guess that sums it up from the Kessler Foundation.
So thank you so much, Eileen, for your words, and I'm sure we will continue to tap on the Kessler Foundation for ideas and moving forward. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Rajat Rashid from the Gallaudet University. And the university is designed to be barrier-free for deaf and hard of hearing students. And it is the only university in the world to teach only in American Sign Language. So over to you.
Thank you so much, and good morning. You're going to hear a male voice who's speaking for me as I sign, and I'll use American Sign Language here. Like she explained, I'm from Gallaudet University. Unfortunately, it's the only university in the world exclusively for deaf and hard of hearing students, or for a disability group. At Gallaudet, we have programs really ranging from birth to continuing education, the PhD level. We have kindergarten programs, model secondary school programs, the high school and the college and a PhD program. We have a little bit of everything for deaf and hard of hearing people. And the key is language. We use sign language. We're a bilingual school, so written English and American Sign Language. And government and private partnerships have enabled us to do this. From 1864, we've been supported by the federal government, Washington. Even though we're a private university, we get federal support. And as Georgia was saying, and I really support and affirm what she was saying, support for disabled people has to be absolutely cross-cutting across everything. I'm waiting for the interpreter to catch up. That's all. Don't worry about it. It'll happen. I don't know if you're used to that at the UN, but there we go. Anyway, that cross-cutting is really important. We have students from all over the world at Gallaudet University. Because we're the only one, it may be the first time in these students' lives that they feel finally that they have not only access but inclusion. And that's a really heartwarming experience to see. But inclusion, that word inclusion, the idea is to be included. For deaf people, they tend to be on the fence a lot. They are excluded a lot. If inclusion isn't done appropriately and properly, then they're excluded. Even though they, people say they have access, they don't really. And as a deaf woman, deafness is the nexus, at the nexus of disability and language. If a deaf person walks past you on the street, you won't notice it, like me. It's not visible. You can see my race. You can see I'm not using a wheelchair. There are some things you can see, but my disability, if you will, is really a language problem. I don't have a physical disability. I have an invisible disability. You can't tell that I'm deaf right away. You can't tell that I'm different right away, just by looking at it. Deaf people have been socially marginalized for years, not included, because provision is not made for language access. A deaf person can be included in a group, but still be excluded. The conversations around the water cooler, even if they provide access and interpreters, it's not around the water cooler. We're excluded there. Real inclusion goes much farther. Where deaf people are physically in an office, they have access, but they may not be included. So that's not full access. Oh yes, we do have some PowerPoints happening at the same time. Next page. Inclusion for deaf people really takes many different forms. It's not one size fits all. There's some deaf people who can hear a little bit and speak a little bit. I am stone cold deaf, deaf as a post. So deafness comes in all varieties. And so there are different levels of access depending on the deaf person. There's the micro level, what happens in an office with a deaf person who is included in the staff, and the macro level, what happens more on the policy level. And people confronted with a deaf person for the first time, they often just don't know what to do at all. You can use it. They ask me how to do it. You can use technology that you have. Your phones, you can text to each other. Your laptops, you can text each other. We've become addicted to the technology. Interpreters, like the 4 interpreters you see here in this room, that provides access. So interpreters are provided for meetings, but then after the meeting, the deaf person sometimes is left alone. You have to think about how you really include that person in the office. Not just providing accessibility, but really including that person. How can you fit that person's needs? How can you accommodate that person? One idea is an office mentor, for example. If you're not sure exactly how the office works, you need to be explained. That needs to be explained to you. To be really included in a group. Next slide. Remember, Gallaudet is an educational institution. And one of our recent projects in Haiti, our MA degree in international development, Dr. Audrey Hooper is here in the room with us. Students worked in Haiti with this project, with a big deaf group, and there's Haitian Sign Language. Our group of interns helped them record their language so that they could be documented And then Gallaudet linguists started studying what they recorded and giving their government information about the Haitian Sign Language. Next slide, yes. The language of signs in Haiti,
The next slide, please. Right there.
LSH. And the joke is that deaf people can't read the slide and look at me signing at the same time. So I do pause. That's a little part of what we do. The deaf community in Haiti wanted to document their language, their sign language, and help develop a dictionary. We started small, but the idea was to prove in our advocacy efforts with the government that this is a true natural language, a full language with its own grammar and syntax, and deserving of support. So people from Gallaudet went and helped with the documentation process, published a dictionary, tried to advertise it for them, but it was their project, it was not our project. So it's important to recognize the group that you're working with. They are the experts. They know what their language is. We have certain skills we can support them with, but it's got to be their project, and you can't take over the project. That's a true partnership. So that's an example of some of the things we do. So even on a national level, it's important to work with local deaf people. The same for any disability group. But for us, language is key. We are disabled in a sense, but we're really a language minority. And you have to start with that for deaf people. I know I don't want to go too long, and I know we'll have a discussion now, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rashid. And I just want to tell everyone that there is a lot that we can learn from her. She is the professor in the Department of Business at the university, and perhaps very relevant to us, she is also a professor in the master's program in international development. So this is one of the areas that I'm sure we will top on you, not only today, but in the future. So thank you so much for joining us. So now I'm going to go across the oceans and go to another part of the world. And I'm going to ask our colleague from Georgia, Katuna Sandrosh-Chivila, to join us. Katuna is our program associate and innovation specialist in our Georgia office. And she has been spearheading a number of initiatives in Georgia regarding people with disabilities. So I'm going to hand it over to you for the next 5 to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, and greetings, everybody. It is very fortunate that I have to talk just right after Dr. Rashid's talk, and I'm sorry that you cannot see me because having worked with the community of deaf people, I have actually started learning sign language. And it's the most interesting thing that was striking from this conversation was the word, they are the experts. And this is from the angle that we are approaching our work, not only at UNDP Georgia, which I represent, but also I'm a member of the Mountain Innovation Team in the Istanbul Regional Hub, and which we apply the same principle across the board when we're talking about the innovation. So what I'm going to talk about is not only about the work that we do with persons with disabilities, but also about the new ways of engagement. We started our conversation with partnerships, the new partnerships. How do we do business differently? How do we find the new ways of engagement with the citizens, users, all the experts that we have not been engaged before? This process worldwide, then it's the second slide. This process worldwide has been developing through the establishment of design thinking labs, or the institutions that are applying the new methods of design across the globe. And currently, there are around 135, more than 135 institutions that are working on it. At UNDP, we are looking at this experience, next slide Ben, and we are trying to reinvent the public services, the case that I'm going to look into this today, from the perspective of the user, from the perspective of the person who these services are designed for. If you see the picture, usually the design implies the perspective of the designer, the one who makes the services, while the user experience might dramatically differ from it. The next slide. The design principles, I will just scan through it, imply the inclusion of the experts or the users from the very beginning of the design cycle, development cycle of services, throughout ideating, developing, prototyping, testing phases. In Georgia, we have a very interesting situation. If you can see the picture of Tbilisi Public Service Hall, it is the symbol of the dramatic change in the civil service, in the public service that happened over the last decade. And if you can see the next photo with the view of the service hall from inside, this is the example of one-stop shop, which provides over 400 services, face-to-face or electronically, starting from changing the passport to registering the business. And it can be done within a day's time, literally. And in the circumstances when we have such a forward-looking service, public service redesigning happening in the country, in the circumstances when the government is represented, next slide then please, by predominantly young leaders, young civil servants who are very open to changes. On the picture you can see Natalia Doliashvili, who is heading the Human Rights Secretariat at the administration of the government of Georgia. And she is one of the leading persons who is looking into the issues of inclusion of persons with disabilities in the implementation of Human Rights Action Plan in Georgia. And I will talk about that experience, how we practically do it later, a little bit later. On the next slide, you can see that along with these processes of forward-looking public service changes, the leadership, which is young and open to innovation, we also have a new paradigm informing of the citizenry, the critical mass of people, citizens, who are open to communication with the decision makers, and they speak the same language. When the Georgian government 2 years ago approached UNDP with the request to support them in the engagement of different groups of citizens in public service delivery, UNDP was in a we were in the position, what else can we provide for the government, which is as it is innovative? We looked at the external experience on the next slide then please, and upon the request of the government, we set up the Government Innovation Service Lab with the help of the Innovation Facility, including and Istanbul Regional Hub, which is looking into creating the platform where citizenry meets with the decision makers, with the government. On the next slide, you can see the first exercise of co-designing the public services when persons with disabilities, for the first time in Georgia, sat together with the emergency services, 112 services in Georgia, to walk through the service model, which was currently operating in the country 2 years ago, and redesign it to fit the needs of the deaf community, people with deaf and speech impairment. It was a 2-day workshop. We applied the new model of design thinking, and although these two sides, the Deaf Union and 112, were trying to talk to each other for 2 years before that, and couldn't come to the common understanding how it would look like, within 2 days' time, could we move to the next slide, please? They had a common picture of what the services could look like. And on the next, they visually could imagine it. And on the next slide, you can see the new systems, the revised process and delivery model that both users and the service providers
Katuna?
Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes, we lost you for a second. You're back.
Okay. I was talking about the service model that both sides agreed to. And can you hear me, or am I still breaking?
No, you're back. And that's exactly where we left off.
Okay, great. If you move to the next slide, you can see the actual 112 operation room with the several screens. After 6 months from this exercise, we had first model of services piloted, and it was tested together again with the Deaf Union. I forgot to mention that in the room when we were designing this service, we had sign language interpreters. After 6 months, 112 Services recruited 8 sign language interpreters who work as operators as well. We have 2 kinds of services. It is SMS messaging service and video call. And during the testing phase, I would again echo Dr. Rashid, the linguistic part became very apparent. When we were looking how we designed the registration form for persons with disabilities, the immediate feedback at the testing phase was that linguistically they wouldn't understand it. So we immediately revised it to fit their requirements. If you look at this picture, it demonstrates on the left side of it, you can see how they pictured the services would look like. And on top, you can actually see the sign language interpreter answering the Skype call just 6 months after the initial intervention. Apart from recruiting the sign language interpreter, so how does this change the new approach, the new way of engagement? How does it change the culture of the organization? 112 Emergency Services, as soon as they recruited the sign language interpreters, Public Service Development Agency operating within the public service hall that you saw earlier, they also recruited sign language interpreters to provide the services. Another important aspect was that 112 Services requested UNDP to use the same methodology to review their internal procedures to fit them to the new paradigm of service provision. And most interesting result that we didn't expect to have was that many of the calls that the 112 Services is receiving is to report the cases of human rights violation, mainly domestic violence cases. So this is a kind of an additional added value or channel of communication. The service is actively used. There are altogether 2,000 deaf people registered in the Deaf Union currently in Georgia. The 112 service registration includes around 450 people. And as we can see from the latest statistics, video calls are used more than SMS calls because literacy rate in Georgia is low. And the sign language, Georgian Sign Language is currently being actively taught among the deaf community. The service has received international recognition, several awards. This year it got outstanding innovation, International European Emergency Number Association Award among 82 countries worldwide. The community of the community that we have engaged with through Innovation Service Lab in the government of Georgia and UNDP has been part of all the follow-up other engagements, redesigning exercises or public services that we have conducted since then for the past 2 years. And you can see examples of this, like mobile service delivery to the remote areas of Georgia, redesigning the scientific library concept, reverse engineering the public service design exercise in Georgia for the first time. The latest engagement, however, and I will finish in a minute, came within the framework of Social Good Summit in September, when we brought the community of the disabled persons with disabilities to look at the ways how we could co-design the implementation, actual implementation of the national human rights in Georgia. And the Natalia, who you saw earlier in the picture, following after the end of day one, she said that these have been the most efficient way of engagement she had ever witnessed. So this process just started with the administration of the government of Georgia, and we will be continuing. 2 years after, and this is the last slide then, 2 years after we started this new model of engagement, with the users and with it happened so that in Georgia, this distinguished group happened to be persons with disabilities. We have mobilized 4.5 million British pounds for public administration reform support in Georgia for the next 4 years. And yesterday, we had 5 government agencies, including government administration, looking at the framework to work on for the administration reform, which is centered around user-centered approach and co-designing of solutions together with the citizens. In other groups that earlier UNDP had no direct way of engaging with. I think this is it. There is much more to tell. I'm happy to answer your questions. We are talking extensively about it on the regional website and the medium. So it is, again, thank you very much for your attention. It's a privilege to be part of this discussion.
Tatuna, thank you. And this is one of the many innovations throughout our country offices. So we will be tapping on you to share that initiative globally. So now I come to my last speaker. And so let me introduce you to Sue Myers. Sue works in the National Organization on Disability. It is a private non-profit organization that focuses on increasing employment opportunities for people with disabilities. So I'm going to hand it over to Sue for the next few minutes to share your experience and suggestions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I will say National Organization on Disability is a 34-year-old organization, and we do focus exclusively on employment. So of all the speakers here, I think we probably have the narrowest focus. So hopefully I can give some really specific suggestions. You will notice that some of them we've already heard this morning, and I'm going to repeat them because the fact that more than one of us is saying the same thing, I think is actually really important. So you're controlling this house?
I'm happy to hand it over.
Great. That makes life a little bit easier. We work exclusively on the employer side. We call it the demand side of the employment equation. There's lots and lots of organizations out there working with individuals with disabilities, helping them understand accommodations, get job skills, find their way to work. We focus on the employer side, saying, if we go into the company and we help get the company ready to employ successfully people with disabilities and then find the right people with disabilities to employ, that's the way to close the loop. Kessler was actually a big part of the start of this. Elaine mentioned Lowe's. That was a project that we did with Kessler's support, sort of piloting this idea of employer side focus and hiring.
the three engagements that I have up on the slide are just representative of very different kinds of things that companies are doing with our help. So Starbucks created a whole training academy exclusively for people with disabilities, where the graduates of that program, many of them get hired into Starbucks, but not all of them. But it's based in Arizona. The original one was based in Arizona. All of the other companies in Arizona figured out, oh wait, these people are graduating from this program. They're trained up. They've got a leg up, and so all the other companies hire whoever Starbucks doesn't hire out of that program. It's great success. Lowe's mentioned with Elaine. That was a hiring program in their distribution centers. In 18 months that we were working with them, they hired about 150 people with disabilities. In the 18 months after we left them to continue the program, they hired another 150. And they found that their retention rate was higher, meaning turnover was lower, their absenteeism was lower, and therefore productivity much higher. So I think that leads to the sort of obvious, I skipped one. PwC was a very different, PricewaterhouseCoopers, consulting firm, knowledge workers, very different type of engagement. And that was really an assessment of their policies and procedures at a high level, looking at sort of the data, where they stand against benchmarks, and what areas they could really be improving in terms of the experience that their employees with disabilities are having in their workforce. So our focus is, this is not charity. For companies to hire people with disabilities is a competitive advantage. McKinsey puts the talent shortage in the US at 47 million. They expect it to be 95 million by 2020. That's a huge gap, and you need to get, the companies are going to need to get the best talent out there, period. And excluding people with disabilities, you're shooting yourself in the foot compared to your competitors, certainly. And then the how, I'm going to skip right to this because I don't want to forever. There's sort of two sides to disability inclusion in your workforce. One is culture, and the other is policies and practices. There's companies good at one and at the other, and a few that are getting good at both. So the culture side is, looking at what the experience of the person in your workplace is. It's already been said today, having senior leaders talk about their own experience with disability, meaning come out about the fact that they have a disability or that they're connected to disability and how they've made it work for them, is a huge change in the culture. And it will make a difference in whether your employees identify themselves as having a disability and ask for accommodations that are likely to make them more effective at their jobs. Companies are often afraid of people asking for accommodation, but in fact, accommodations is what makes people their most efficient and most effective. And the real goal should be get people to ask for what they need to be great employees. Disability awareness and etiquette training is a really important tool when used correctly. It has to, like, if there's just a training and people go to it and then nothing changes in their lives, you are not improving your culture. You have to be pairing it with real change and in real communication of that change at all levels of your organization. This is some interesting statistics out of a survey done by Getting Hired last year. This was a survey of job seekers with disabilities. And the top thing that they said is important, the most important to them when looking for a new job, is having a diversity and disability-friendly environment. The other thing, so that's culture, right? The other things are in that category of policies and procedures: flexibility, benefits, compensation, and career advancement opportunities, right? The fact that the company doesn't just know how to hire me, but knows how to actually help me move forward in my career. Those things will also make the decision in whether people choose to disclose their disability, which, you know, people have talked here about. Actually, Dr. Rashid was talking about Are people included at the water cooler? If you have an environment where a colleague feels comfortable texting their colleague, oh, how was your weekend? You know, instead of just thinking, oh, we're only here to work and that's the only time we're going to communicate, right? Similarly with other disabilities, if you don't feel like you can say, oh, actually, you know, I spent the weekend struggling with this, you know, or I spent the weekend going for treatment on that, then you're really not letting your colleagues know you and you're not truly being included in their community at work. So the policies and practices side, it's huge, right? So there's this is sort of the different categories at a glance, right? So the experience of the employees in the workplace, that includes physical accessibility, right? So how do they enter the building? Are they able to make use of all of the spaces? Are they able to communicate effectively with their colleagues, with their clients? Is the website available? Are the online tools accessible? And so that's both the physical and technical accessibility piece. The accommodations process, you know, I just said, it's so important that you get your employees to ask for the accommodations that are going to make them effective. One barrier to that, actually a really, really common barrier, is people don't know how to ask for accommodation, right? Companies all have accommodation policies. Like every company we go to, do you have an accommodation policy? Yes, they do. You know, it's like 97% or something have an accommodations policy. Do you know where to find the accommodations policy? No. Do your hiring managers know where to find the accommodation policy? No. Does your HR personnel know? No. Right? So what is the point of having a policy if even the managers and HR don't know how to find it? Certainly an employee that's considering asking for an accommodation isn't going to find it. And you're not going to be encouraging them to ask unless they absolutely must, and then they'll do the work to figure out how to do it. There's things like, let me just rephrase it this way. We have a couple of clients that do this. They look at every aspect and they use their employee resource groups, their disability employee resource groups, as a tool, right? They say, we want you to tell us as you go through your work here, what isn't accessible to you, right? So all different disabilities, different types of access, and we want you to tell us that we can fix it, right? It accomplishes two things. One, you figure out where your barriers are and they're there. And two, you're telling your employee, it's a big culture change. You're both indicating to your employees that you want to fix the barriers, and you're engaging them in your company and the improvement of your company, which is going to increase their likelihood of staying with you and developing their careers there. The burnish your employer brand. I don't know whether this should fall under culture or policies and procedures, but policies and practices. But recruiting materials should feature people with disabilities, right? If you want applicants to think, oh, okay, I can picture myself here, you kind of need to include that in your materials. And remember that people in wheelchairs are not the only people with disabilities. Make sure your application is accessible. Make sure you're asking about accommodations from very first interactions for interviews and beyond. Make sure your recruiters and hiring managers are trained to carry that disability-friendly brand all the way through. At NOD, we have introduced a leading disability employer seal last year that we're hoping can help some companies that are really doing the right things increase that brand that okay, when you're looking at potential employees, they're going to see you as, oh, okay, this is going to be a place that's going to support me in my career development. And mentoring, which Dr. Sheet also mentioned, is also really critical for all employees. But there was a recent Harvard Business School study that sort of said the only people who actually sort of effectively find their own mentors are white men, able-bodied white men, right? So that means everybody else, including people with disabilities, will benefit from formal programs around mentoring. And I'll just wrap with sort of the what we do with companies, just to give a sense in 2 minutes of how we approach helping companies do this. We have a corporate leadership council. It's a membership. We do a lot of knowledge sharing activities and events with the council where we let companies learn from each other and learn from us and other experts. We have a consulting business, so we consult on we have a survey tool that we already had UNDP members signed up for this year, which just opened in October, where employers, doesn't have to be companies, can go in and answer questions about their own practices and policies, and then get back a scorecard of this is where you stand against the benchmarks of other organizations that are filling this out, just to get a sense of what areas do you most want to work on, what should you prioritize. Off of that, we have a disability inclusion accelerator. It's based on the data of the tracker, and we do some focus groups beyond that to get a sense of is what your employees feeling actually being reflected in what you're answering as the answers to these questions. And we give it's a very high level. Here's the things you want to most think about changing. Here's some ideas that are short term, medium term. Start planning. And then from there, we do full program design and planning engagements, hiring engagements like the one I talked about at Lowe's, and awareness and etiquette training. And that is where I'll leave it. Our clients love us. Okay, that kind of goes without saying, right? And I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Sue, and thank you to everyone who has just spoken. I think it has been a very enriching presentations, and now I'm going to open it to comments, concerns, questions. So just to organize ourselves. So here in New York, I would like you to raise your hand if you have any comment, concern, or question. For our colleagues that are from the country office, unfortunately, I cannot ask you to raise your hand because you are too many countries connected. So the way we are going to do it is that you can send your question, comment electronically. We do have
Good to go.
Yeah, so they can type, there's a comment box, they can type in
okay,
their
so there's a comment box, and we already have someone here just ready to receive your comments and questions. Please don't do them all the same time. And then we will read the questions here or the comments, and then we will address them. So in order to give all our country officers some time, I'm going to start first with New York, and then I will move over to our country officers or regional hubs or liaison officers who have joined us today during the session. So let me start with New York. Any comment, concern, question, idea, contribution? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. For me, it's a contribution, but let me start by saying it's really been a very fascinating discussion to be able to learn from all of you and hear what you're doing. I think, well, I picked up three things which are the most important, three words. One is for the SDGs, we're saying leaving no one behind. The whole issue of marginalization, the issue of inclusion. So for us as a UN organization, and in terms of the work that we do, we need to see how is it that we focus the question of disabilities within that context. And I really appreciate what Georgia was talking about, IDA and mainstreaming. For us, I think in the Africa region, because if you look at already the difficulties in terms of disabilities within the American context, the European context, you can just imagine within the African context, how is it that we can define disabilities and how can we then deal with it? So, but for us, if we are saying leave nobody behind, we then need to see how do we include people with disabilities in the work that we do. So it's the importance for us is understanding the scope of the problem, but then how do we mainstream? And I just want to share something that we have been initiating in one of our country offices, and this is in South Africa. And it's using the knowledge product that we in UNDP have, which is a human development report, and which has a human development index, which looks at what is the access of people in terms of the capacity that they have in terms of the lifespan, the education, as well as the income. In South Africa, the country office there, in discussions with the other UN agencies, said, well, and working with the Department of Social Affairs, is to say, well, let's look at also a disability index. How can we introduce a disability index and link it to our concept of human development? So that's something that's just been initiated, and it's something very, for us, it's very exciting because it's linking it to a knowledge product, and it's also in terms of how can we mainstream the whole aspect. So I think it's also taking the angle of policy and advocacy, because that's how, if we can make our leadership in the countries where we work with understand, when you marginalize and you don't include disabled people, this is the cost that you have in terms of human development in the country context. So this is just a beginning for us.
Thank you, Ruby.
I have a comment on that. So one of the things you hear a lot internationally, and there's a lot of foundations and funders working in, is individual entrepreneurship, which can work to help people with disabilities. But one of the things we've done is look at social enterprise, which is, for you, would be more what Georgia was talking about, is taking organizations of people with disabilities, or DPOs in different countries, and having them start a business. And what that does with some funding is allows them to first spin up some income back to them, but also employ large numbers of people with disabilities. So we've done a couple of projects that have been very successful in the States. One of them is a food truck, actually. It's based in St. Louis, and it only serves desserts. And what we helped them fund with was buy the truck and outfit it. And then the organizations were able to get some local matching funding. And although it's a small number of people hired, so there's about 20 people that work in the project. So you have the bakers in the kitchens, you have people on the truck, you have people who sell the product. It gives a lot of opportunities for a diverse group of disabilities to work in the project. The other one we've had is a digital scanning and mail business. So people take documents, some people shred the documents, some people scan the documents. That one, some of these projects have invest in equipment, but once you have that capital investment, it really can funnel a lot of people through it. So I would encourage you to think about that as a way for local partnerships, even with governments or not, because we think a lot about individuals starting their own businesses, and maybe it creates some employment for them and some additional income, but it doesn't increase the numbers of people with disabilities in more groups. And Shelley and I always talk about the scalability of things. How do you have a great project in the community, but then how do you scale it through a system? Which even UNDP, how to scale it through your system. You start with one agency that's looking to hire people with disabilities, but how do you scale it more globally?
Sorry.
I'd also like to thank everyone. It was really insightful and lots to learn from us, and particularly the strong message. Understand the people affected by the problem, work with them, they are the bearers of solutions. Just to add on to this, the work of Georgia inspired a number of country offices. In Egypt, for example, you convened also people with disabilities, hearing and speaking disabilities, but also people in wheelchairs. And out of a similar exercise of support Kaduna actually came different initiatives, but one of them was the idea of a person in a wheelchair to map the accessible places in Cairo and other cities through an app, but also an SMS system, an online site. And this person actually founded his own enterprise and made it to an MIT accelerator. Apart from a couple of other things that they developed, their board game that is now being worked with the Ministry for Education to put in the national curricula to understand the perspectives of people with hearing and speaking disabilities better. And in Armenia, likewise, we work with people with disabilities and have a very similar system, which now is also being used by tourist sites because many tourists come with heavy luggage and they're interested with restaurants have ramps. So there are nice spillover effects and also business incubation from that perspective, how does innovation work?
Strollers.
And strollers, yeah, that's another factor, exactly.
Thank you.
Also, thanks from here. I have two questions. And to the parent, they are a little bit similar, but here it is. How can UNDP better think about disability and its origin? We unfortunately work in countries which are active war. And this means a lot of people, civilians, not only soldiers, but civilians, they get hurt. And that means later in life, and for strange reasons, suddenly they face disability. Should we think about a different approach? And where can we learn more about what do you do then? And it's also, how can we better think about how disability cut across the gender? Is being disabled as a woman different from being disabled as a man? And obviously we work in community or in countries where clearly there is a significant gender gap. And so therefore the hypothesis is it is different. But how can we learn more about this? How can we better think about this? Because for us to be effective as a development agency, we must understand the nuances here. So anything the panel can help us to think about.
I have a slight answer to the first and a bigger answer to the second. The issue of people developing disabilities over the course of their careers and how do they, continue return to work. Prudential Insurance actually is doing a lot of work and research around that. It makes sense from the insurance company that the insurance companies would be the ones doing that. And so there's some information out there. One of the keys is stay connected to your employee through whatever leave they might take in the initial occurrence of their disability, if that happens, and trying to get them back to work as soon as possible. So the longer a person stays away from work the much less likely they are to return to work, and there's all kinds of psychological research about why that is. The gender side, Working Mother magazine actually just released a study last month that looks at disability in the workplace, and they talked about gender. They looked at the comparison between gender, and they also looked at the comparison between apparent and non-apparent disabilities. Maybe surprisingly, maybe not, the sort of engagement statistics for those with non-apparent disabilities were much worse than those with apparent, and for women were much worse than for men.
I want to talk about the gender gap a little bit. We're doing some research in Cambodia, and one thing I found through my research there is that deaf women have a higher risk for domestic violence, for sexual violence and domestic violence, because of some people in Cambodia think that because they're deaf, they won't be able to identify the verb, they won't be able to talk, or a deaf woman working alone at home faces break-ins and sexual assault that way. So it's really, really important to consider gender and its relationship to violations of rights of disabled people. And there are programs that are specifically for hearing people, that deaf people, able-bodied people, that disabled people lack because they just don't have access. Mm-hmm. And Audrey, you wanted to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that last part that Erin was saying, that there are programs for able-bodied people, but not for deaf people specifically. So those women are missed in the public provision of services.
And before I hand it over to the others, is there anything else on the Cambodia project that you would like to highlight to us?
One organization that I'm working with, the organization provides services for victims of sexual violence. The guy who runs the organization asked me, how could we get deaf people involved in the program? How do we reach deaf people? And because they have a hotline, and I said, yes, but the hotline is either a text hotline or a voice hotline. You need to find different ways of making it accessible for deaf women and deaf people in general who don't use the phone. I mean, they might even have texting iPhones or texting phones, and they could, if they could just give them a text, the answer can be very simple, actually.
Okay, thank you. So I have four more speakers. So let me start with Dr.
And going back to your question, I'm thinking one phrase that has really stuck with me: ability is temporary. If I'm quoting it right, I think all of us at some point become disabled in one way or another, through accidents, through you have to use a crutch or a wheelchair, or after an accident, or your hearing goes, your eyesight goes. So we need to design for all of that, universal design. Because the issue is not just a group of people we call disabled, the issue is everybody. And it affects everybody in life. You can fall at any time and have to use a wheelchair, even if it's temporarily for a few months. You have an accident. Anything could happen. So we don't need to be pointing out this group called disabled. We need to widen the scope of our understanding of disability. Here at the UN, I don't know how many countries that are members, but you find ways to accommodate each other, and you treat disabled people the same way you treat all humans. There is diversity in the world. I mean, I know I'm thinking very generally here, but that is the big picture. We need to widen our scope of what we think of as disabled.
Thank you. Elaine, you had some comments?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the going back to the workplace after a significant injury. We do a lot of research on spinal cord injury and return to work, and we're currently actually in a research project. And what we found, especially with spinal cord injury, is that somebody who is working one profession all of a sudden becomes injured. So in the case of war, if you become injured as a result, and you may not return to that particular, so it's not as if you're working with, to your point, say that you're working with an employer and then your employer has the support. This you're totally had a severed relationship maybe with what you were doing previously. Some of the research found is that after being in the hospital and being in rehabilitation, there's not the introduction of the concept of return to work. There's the introduction of the concept that you're going to be charity. You're going to either in the U.S. receive some sort of public benefits, or perhaps in another country be supported by your family another way. So the research we're doing right now is from the time of injury, when you're still in that, you're stable, but maybe you're still recovering or recuperating or rehab, that they introduce a concept of, yes, you're going to be able to go back to work in a different capacity, but you're going to be able to be a productive person in some capacity, whether that means as a volunteer, maybe that means in paid employment, maybe that means a combination of the two. But the idea is to reintroduce the idea of you're going to be part of society, you're going to be part of society maybe in a different way than you experienced before, but you still, to your point, you're still in our community. And you're a functioning member of community, although you may have to change how you interact with the community, how the community interacts.
Okay, thank you. We are already beyond the time that was allotted, but because we started late and because I see that everyone is so into this, I won't stop, but if everyone is okay, can we go until 11:30? Yes? Good. Excellent. So let me now turn to Georgia. You wanted to make some comments, and then I'll go across the. So Georgia.
I just wanted to reflect a little bit on the two questions that you had, and I think it ties in well to how it has been for me as a representative of IDA to hear about what is happening, in these programs that are being run. It's really heartening. We work a lot, on the principles that are enshrined in the CRPD. So to hear about Article 4.3 in practice is it's really motivating. To know that this is actually coming to fruition. You were asking, what to do on the ground, and especially in difficult circumstances. And I think to go back to some of the main points that I spoke to in the very beginning, and Article 4.3 is that you don't have to reinvent the wheel, because DPOs have knowledge and expertise on how UNDP can create their policies, programs, initiatives that are going to be inclusive and that are going to recognize some of those people who are who are more marginalized or who are more impacted in difficult situations. And it's not just DPOs, we also work a lot in partnership, and that's what a lot of our work is about. We work together closely with the International Disability and Development Consortium, a group of non-governmental organizations, 26 I believe they are, and they also have members on the ground. So for example, in humanitarian emergencies, we work with CDM International. So utilizing DPOs and our connections and our partners is a really great way to gather more knowledge and information. Talking about how do we make sure that disability is cross-cutting, I think we need to go back to thinking about how can we ensure that UNDP is really engaging in cross-agency initiatives. I think there's a lot of great work happening across agencies. UNICEF is an excellent example of this. They have a disability unit now, and that is going, working down into their UNICEF country teams and programs. UN Women has a focal point. The UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has a focal point within the Secretariat. So just knowing that those people are there and are trying to connect the dots will also help to sort of realize across, how you can greater expand this cross-cutting nature of disability. And I think just to perhaps make one final point, when I mentioned Indigenous and mentioned it before as well, we work with an Indigenous Persons with Disabilities Global Network. And nowhere is it more highlighted than when they are advocating or when they are bringing their stories to the table, that, not just as a person with a disability, but also being a woman, also being Indigenous, also living in a rural area that is a small island developing state that is more at risk in disaster, in situations of disaster. All of these things impact to have really, it's just experiencing multiple discrimination on a level that we can't even imagine. And it's not just Indigenous people and women. We also really need to pay attention to persons with psychosocial disabilities. They are also extremely marginalized in our society and are often relegated to considerations of mental health. And that's something that's really concerning for us. Persons with psychosocial disabilities often face extreme violations of their rights. And it's an area that we are beginning to tackle together with as many people as possible. But it's something that we need to think about as we move forward, that disability isn't about one type of access or inclusion. And that's why having the perspectives and inclusion and participation of persons with disabilities themselves will really make sure that as we move forward, we're doing it in the right way for everyone.
Thank you, Georgia.
Just very briefly, on the issue of gender, sorry, I've managed to get a reaction to this focal point for UNDP and other interagency and support groups. We know how gender disability is in developing countries. Whilst it's 20% of people in developing countries with disabilities, 75% of those 20% are women. 3 out of 4 in developing countries, so it's an incredibly gendered issue. And there's hard data which clearly supports the colleague on the issue of that you raised about Cambodia, that they're far more likely to be victims of sexual and gender-based violence, to be poor, to be excluded, to be able to have less access to family planning across the board. Actually, I wanted to mention that the Secretary General will be issuing a report on this issue at the 72nd session of the General Assembly next year. And he's going to be issuing a note for balance for all countries and UN agencies to participate in the report, because it's really seems to be the nexus of so many aspects of intersectional discrimination, as Georgia was mentioning. So there's going to be an opportunity in the next 9 months to really engage on that issue for the UN system and for member states to come up with this report that will be issued next year. And then it also relates to other aspects of our work, because we know, for instance, in disaster relief, 40% of the people that did not manage to get out of Port-au-Prince after the Haiti earthquake had disabilities, 40%. And it goes way beyond the 20% of the general population. So it's something that there's a multidimensional aspect to it, and unfortunately it's a nexus of intersecting discrimination, as Georgia was mentioning. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shelley London from the Hoses Family Foundation. Thank you for including me today, and thank you for such an important discussion and the work you're doing and about to do. Dr. Rashid and Georgia spoke about the definition of disabilities, and I just want to add to that discussion for a moment. 1 out of 5 people have brain-based learning and attention issues, such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and those are also invisible disabilities. And in fact, the graduation rate from high school, the unemployment rate, the prison rate, all those kinds of social problems are significantly higher for people with learning and attention issues. And yet, these issues have nothing to do with intelligence. And so as you're beginning your own hiring programs, what you will find is that people with learning and attention issues can be wonderful employees, rise to the top of any organization, but they need supports, and they often do not disclose, and they hide. And so I just wanted to make sure that this huge part of the population of invisible disabilities was something that you were thinking of. And we'd be delighted to help you on this and any other things that we can help you with. So thank you.
Good, thank you so much, Shaylee. So before, okay. Yes, you have, yes, sure.
I'd just like to add to what Dr. Rashid was saying for the definition of disability. And also with the discussion about how we can identify people with disabilities and what those categories are. So we're talking about the Washington Group list and the idea of the disability index. Often, deaf people who are signers are not included, or rather don't check that box in the disability index. So in our experience, as an example from my research in Vietnam, they have a Vietnamese household living standard survey. So this is an index that they use. That was the first time that they used the Washington Group list. That was in 2006. And so my research as a linguistic anthropologist was related to that. And so some of the analysis that was done found out that for 90 million people out of that population, there were 3.5% of people that identified as someone with a disability. 3.5 million people with a disability, excuse me. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I want to make sure I have the right numbers. It was 3.5 million, and it was 1.5 that identified as deaf and hard of hearing, which was a huge number. And deaf people weren't filling out that index, or rather that survey themselves. It was the family members that were filling out that surveys. So there's no information then about language. And there's no information about multiple disabilities. And so that is a huge loss because the government wants to know how they can teach people who have disabilities and deaf people, but they're missing this information. So there's no information with regard to language.
So from both sides, from the policy side and for the programming side, and for the people in the community side, there's really a loss of information there. And so there needs to be a development of some type of index, yes, about disability and for people who would check or maybe not check that box, if you will, but also with regard to language. And so that would be a suggestion that I would have to research and to figure out what language people are using, because there might be a group of people who will not check a box for disability, but will say, these are the languages that I use. And the technology as well. I use SMS, or I don't use SMS, or I use video relay service, or I do not use video relay service. So those types of questions to be separated out with regard to language and technology and disability.
Thank you. One last comment from Ruby before we wrap it up with Jens and Sarah.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on something that Shelley was saying about other invisible disabilities. You know, I think this is a very interesting conversation, but I think it's just a beginning, because we need to continue it further. And, you know, in many of the countries, Jens talked about countries in war and conflict where we're working. But in many of the countries we work in, there are also issues of humanitarian disaster, you know, malnutrition, and especially when you have children with malnutrition. Now, we, as the UN system, you're responding to the malnutrition today, but let's not forget those same children 10, 15, 20 years down the road are going to be children with disabilities. So we have to also maybe start thinking about how do we, you know, program that into the work that we're doing. So it's just...
Okay, so Sarah first, your
Thank
final
you.
words
Final words. Hopefully they're not final. I agree with Ruby. I think this has been
for today.
For today, exactly, before 11:30. But no, just to thank all of the colleagues. It's really been it's been fascinating, but it's also been very informative and I think quite thought-provoking in terms of how we as UNDP can take this discussion forward. And here I'm thinking about it in the two angles. How do we as UNDP as an organization and an employer, but also very much how do we as UNDP as a human agency working with our partners on the ground. And just, you know, I spoke at the beginning about this concept of leaving no one behind, because I think that is so critical to our work and the work that we're doing at the country level and really supporting, whether it's the national or the local partners or the civil society. But my own personal reflection is that what I would not want to see in 5, 10, 15 years is that this notion of leaving no one behind becomes rhetoric, that, you know, it's a label. So, you know, rural persons with disabilities, gender, and so forth. And I think what this conversation has shown to me is the complexity of that notion of leaving no one behind, the importance of it, the complexity, and I think the challenge. And a few aspects that struck me, let's say in practical terms, where I think we need to be thinking about how do we invest more, how do we take this forward. First is on the issue of data. Georgia, I think you talked about it at the beginning, but also how do we actually have specific definable outcomes that we're working on with the partners. And we've seen the challenge of data overall on every possible issue. I think, you know, our donor countries are even struggling with the data, let alone some of the countries that have capacity issues. I think this is one area where we're thinking about how do we support at the country level that issue of the data, the disaggregation, but really the quality of the data as well, that really captures these complexities that we're able to grasp that. But I was also quite struck on when we think about how we approach inclusion, and Dr. Rashid, I was quite struck as you were discussing inclusion. There's a practical side of inclusion, but I think it also goes much more behind that to what is really the social inclusion. And if we run the risk of not doing inclusion well, then are we perpetuating exclusion to a certain extent? And I think there's the organizational side where we can look at so many of the great recommendations that you had, but I think it's also very much about this cultural change and this mental change and approach. And it was fascinating for me to hear the example that our colleague in Georgia shared. We call it innovation, but I think it's doing development and working in partnerships the way that we should be doing it. It's using the expertise, it's engaging the partners, testing what works and refining and adapting. And I hope this is something that we can continue learning from. And then I think the final is unemployment, and I'm sure Jens and Marta-Lena will be reflecting on that as how we work as UNDP. But I'm also thinking of the challenge that so many of our countries that we're working with are facing in terms of employment. It's really a very complicated issue, including on the youth employment. And then making that even more, bringing in the issue of disabilities into that. So I think the examples that you've shared with us are very, very useful. I think it gives us a lot of very good thought. I think it brings also in the entrepreneurship, the skills training, and so forth. So just a reflection on our side, I think we have a lot of very, very, very thoughtful and important reflections that we can and will be taking back into our work. So again, I hope this is not a one-time conversation, but just really to thank you. I think it shows the importance, the challenges, but also the potential and the issues that we can be working on together with the partners. Thank you.
Yeah, let me just summarize a few thoughts. And number one is, I think it's quite clear and has been for some time, but you have helped reinforce that understanding disability, people with disability, understanding maybe the definitions is very relevant for the development agenda, and it's very relevant for you. So that's kind of the first thing. Secondly, a couple of messages we heard very clearly. Mainstream, so we will think about that. Be practical, and there were, you gave us concrete ideas, but we did send a little bit about accommodation. Ask for it, find it, and I understand there's much more complexity, but nevertheless, it's a good entry point to reflect. We discussed a lot about recruitment, both for us, but also with many projects, and I think it was good to hear. Well, there's a employee side, but there's an employer side, and I think that also helps to focus us a little bit. It was very clear that we do things, but we are also on the learning side. And my interpretation of what we've been told is, be bold and partner yourself out of your ignorance. There are many other people who have been around this. And I think it just sits extremely well with the sustainable development agenda. The word multidimensional was used in the room. You should know 10 years ago in development, multidimensionality, if you use that word, you don't understand it. Development is about money. We have known for many, many years that human development is multidimensional. So, and then I just two personal reflections. And number one is, I must say that having interpretation in the room, and I'm sharing this with many, I have for 11 years worked in countries where I could not speak the language, in Vietnam and in the former Soviet Union. I have worked with interpretation for many times. And I think it's a reflection that a lot of us inside the organization, we actually know what you mentioned. We have been included with interpretation, and still the party went on and they all spoke Vietnamese, and I had no idea. So we can use introspection. We can look into ourselves, and we will know some of these things. We will know what to do about it. We just need to reflect. And then finally, I'd like to close out. I do think, from a substance point of view, that we need to take into our consideration that disability, or ability rather, as you expressed it, ability is a temporary state of life. And this means that also when you think about it over the course of a generation, it's very important. So we and I think actually the disability links defined that way can help us to also start having youth and being an elder person inside the conversation. So it's a very interesting way, but it just requires reflection. In closing, we will take this agenda forward, and we do have a UN channel. Just important to know, we are genuinely present in 160 countries. We sit with a $5 billion plus portfolio of development projects. This is a lot of money. And this means that we do have channels in the UN. We have responsibilities for what we do, And then also, I particularly have responsibility for how we do things internally, and also having Marcelina with me here today as the Director of Human Resources. We can assure you that you took time to tell us and share, but we will, in a sense, reciprocate and at least be active and commit to take this forward. So with those words, I would like to thank our panelists very, very much from my point of view, and then I'll just hand over just for you.
Thank you. Yeah. So first of all, thank you to the country officers. I don't think that if we didn't have any questions or concerns, it's not an indication that the issue is not there. So thank you to our country officers around the world. Thank you to the team that make this happen behind the scenes. And I'm not going to mention all of them. And that includes all our interpreters today. Thank you to all our speakers and guests today. I think you were really an inspiration to us. I think you energized us more in order to move the agenda forward. It reinforced that none of us are alone, but it also reinforced that if we do it together, we can really make it happen. So the title of today was to make inclusion happen. Inclusion in every sense of the word, and we hope that inclusion and we will support each other in happening both in your areas of work but also in UNDP. So thank you so much to every one of you, and we will continue this journey collectively and together. Thank you.
Thank you.
Was she the right thing?
What did she have a question?
Yeah, I mean, she sent it to me. But she's in the video. So.